he could have taken that, and yes, maybe he could have tried to make a go at peace with the Israelis. But I believe that what was really undermining him at that time was the fact that Hamas had become too powerful. It had become too popular. The tactic of suicide bombings was approved of by more than 50% of the Palestinian people. The steadfast resistance of the Hamas faction was something that was enviable on the Palestinian street. Arafat realized that if he sold out, so to speak, to the Israelis, he would never be able to hold on to the country that he wanted to found. So what did he try to do? He tried to out-Hamas the Hamas organization. He launched what he called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. This was a religious uprising. It was supposed to be like the 1987 uprising, except it was imbued with religious symbols. He called it the Al-Aqsa Intifada, named after the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. He talked about 1 million martyrs marching on Jerusalem. In other words, Arafat realized that if he didn't try to be more like Hamas, he would eventually lose the Palestinian people. Now, at the time, Ariel Sharon was the Prime Minister of Israel. Ariel Sharon had this history that I mentioned earlier with Arafat, where he kicked him out of Lebanon and sent him to Tunisia. Ariel Sharon was not very happy with Yasser Arafat's decision to launch a war. So what does Ariel Sharon do? He essentially destroys every piece of authority, every piece of governance, every building that Yasser Arafat controlled. So whereas I think the Fatah faction was this strong and Hamas was this strong, what Arafat did is by weakening Hamas, or what Sharon did was he weakened the Fatah faction. He weakened Arafat to the point that they became essentially equals. So by the time Yasser Arafat dies in 2004, there is chaos on the streets. Hamas and Fatah are fighting each other openly. They're throwing rocks at each other. They're fighting each other on the campuses of the universities in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And they are shooting at each other and setting off bombs in each other's backyards. This was, of course, not talked about in our media, not talked about anywhere, but that essentially was what led when the election took place in 2006 and what gave way to the 2007 civil war in which Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. That, ladies and gentlemen, in less than 10 minutes is the full history of the inter-Palestinian conflict. But essentially what I try to do here, just to explain to you, is that this is not a new conflict, and nor is it going away anytime soon. The animosity that exists between Hamas and Fatah is not something that will just simply be able to be written off. I can tell you this because I've seen now, we've had a whole bunch of Arab actors, Yemen, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Egypt 4 or 5 times, the Arab League, a whole host of actors have tried to get involved to get Hamas and Fatah to sit down and to lay down their arms and to get back to the business of Palestinian unity and fighting against Israel, fighting against the occupation, doing what the Palestinians are supposed to do in the minds of the Arab world. And each and every time, these talks have failed. Hamas and Fatah still remain at odds with one another, and it is going to be extremely difficult to settle this. Now, there is one other factor that I think is probably worth mentioning for just a few minutes, and that is that apart from the fact that we can't seem to be able to get to a political common ground between Hamas and Fatah, we also have a very prickly issue of geography. If you think about it, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are not connected. So even if the Palestinians were at odds with one another, but were somehow able to agree to some sort of a governing authority, how would one stitch together Fatahland and Hamasistan when, as a matter of fact, there is about 30 miles of the Negev Desert separating the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Now, just by way of background, I'm sure everybody is familiar with some of this, but when the State of Israel was formed in 1948, Israel was not in control of the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. The so-called Palestinian territories were under the control, dare I say, occupation of Egypt and Jordan. From 1948 until 1967, these territories were Egyptian and Jordanian, and there was no discussion about them ever becoming a Palestinian state. It was only when Israel took over these territories, when Israel occupied these territories, if you want to call it that, that's when the discussion began about making the West Bank and the Gaza Strip a Palestinian entity. The Israelis said, listen, if you play ball, if you work with us, we will make this a Palestinian state for you. And this was the narrative that continued from 67 all the way up until the year 2000. What happens in the year 2000? You have the Intifada that I mentioned before that Yasser Arafat launches. It's essentially a war against Israel, but that war is a campaign of suicide bombings. And Israel, left with really very little other choice, does what to prevent the suicide bombings? Creates a barrier, creates a wall, builds a wall around the entire Gaza Strip, builds a wall around 2/3 of the West Bank. Why only 2/3? Because it was it still is extremely expensive to build this barrier. It costs, according to some estimates, anywhere between $5 and $10 million per kilometer to build this high-tech barrier. As a matter of fact, I have a colleague, David Makovsky, who used to work with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He used to joke that if Israel really wanted to finish this barrier, all it would need to do is go to synagogues like this one and pledge to put up plaques on the wall, and just do a tour of the United States, and pretty soon, the plaques would pay for, have the Irving Goldstein section of the West Bank fence. Even a name for it, he was going to call it Plakistan. But the fact remains is that the fence has worked even with only 2/3 of it being complete. There's only been one suicide bombing in the last, I think, 4 years. There was one in the year 2007 or 2008 in the town of Dimona. And there has not been another suicide attack since. So in other words, this has worked. But the downside of that for the Palestinians, from the Palestinian perspective, is that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are further disconnected from one another. In other words, now you've got two separate governments, two separate factions, in two separate mini-states, separated by about 30 miles in the Negev Desert, that are sealed off with fences and walls. And on top of that, I'm not allowed to travel to these places anymore now that I have 13-month-old triplets, but when I was a young graduate student with a little less gray hair, I would run around in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the chagrin of my mother. And I would notice a couple of things that I think are also worth noting here just very briefly. These areas are very different in many other ways. You will hear different dialects spoken in these two territories. You will hear an Egyptian dialect spoken by many people in the Gaza Strip, and you will hear a more Jordanian or Shami dialect spoken in the West Bank. You will see a different economy. The Gaza Strip has almost 50% refugees, so there's a lot of poverty there. Not a lot of industry, and whatever industry Israel left when it evacuated from 2005, the Palestinians summarily destroyed because it was Israeli in origin. Whereas in the West Bank, the Jordanians really helped develop an economy over the years and created a public sector and a private sector. And there, at this point, I think there's about, let's say, 20% refugees in the West Bank. So in other words, you can feel the difference in that sense. And then you've got aid coming into the West Bank right now. The Israelis, United States, the European Union, the United Nations, everybody's trying to essentially bolster the strength of the Fatah faction in the West Bank, whereas in the Gaza Strip, not only was there a war in December of 2008 and January of 2009, Operation Cast Lead, which flattened a lot of infrastructure, but on top of that, there are sanctions in place because Hamas is in fact a terrorist organization that is sponsored by Iran. So what we have is we've got an Islamist organization that's sponsored by Iran, that's under sanctions, and they're not really building anything other than military infrastructure to wait for the next battle against Israel on the one side. And then you've got another faction that is working to try to build some semblance of civil society and try to work with the United States, build an army that would be able to protect the Palestinians. I'm not saying that the Fatah faction is a perfect partner for peace. If you look at their charter, they too call for the destruction of the state of Israel. So I'm not saying that either one is a partner. What I'm saying is that you do have a sense that there are two different governments in these two separate areas with two separate police forces, two separate intelligence apparatus, two separate political visions, two separate approaches for working with the Israelis or the Americans or the Iranians, the Saudis. There are two separate foreign policies, political policies in these two areas, separated by an area 30 miles in the Negev Desert. Ladies and gentlemen, what I think we're looking at here is not just Hamas versus Fatah. I believe that we're looking not at a two-state solution anymore. We could possibly be looking at a three-state solution.